Let's break down every single player that you could possibly need to add off of the waiver wire moving into week 8 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 8 NFL pick'ems are already going live, and their week 7 NFL pick'ems for Monday Night Football are live as well. And Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code the catch a free NFL pick'em for Monday Night Football. And don't worry, if you watch this video later in the week, you're still going to get a free NFL pick'em on Underdog to use towards either Thursday Night Football or Sunday's slate of games. Top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code the catch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em for the week, plus up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up with promo code the catch. Let's kick the video off with the running back position, and I will say it is not the best overall week for the running back position, but we do have some names to go over here. Let's start with Jacksonville Jaguars running back Tank Bigsby, who does sit at 73% rostered, but I think at this point in time, Tank Bigsby's overall roster percentage just needs to be higher. Finished with 23.8 fantasy points in week 7 against the Patriots, 26 rushing attempts, 118 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns. So I know week 6 was, a bomber, right? But that was a bad game script against a good Bears defense. You go back to week 5, 25.9 fantasy points for Bigsby. In week 4, he had 12.8 yards per carry. In week 1, he had 6.08 yards per carry. But kind of the elephant in the room here is that Travis Etienne missed week 7. And going into week 7, basically my advice was, if you own Bigsby, you start him if Etienne is out. If Etienne's not out, then he's more of like a flex play, low-end RB2. So what's going to happen in week 8 if Etienne does play against the Green Bay Packers, who have been pretty solid against the run? Well, I think Bigsby is probably still at least a low-end RB2 at worst. And then on top of that, we'll go ahead and talk about D'Ernest Johnson, who sits at 18% rostered, who's just getting involved in the passing game. He finished week 7 with 10 total fantasy points. You go back to week 6, he had 6.4 fantasy points as well, which nothing great, but had something, right? And 4 targets, 3 receptions, 32 receiving yards this past week, and 4.2 yards per carry, 9 touches, 38 total rushing yards. So, I mean, this is almost like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers situation where, at this point, we don't have just an RB1 and RB2. We have a full-on running back committee. So proceed with some caution, at least with D'Ernest Johnson. I think Bigsby is seeing enough volume overall, whether Etienne is hurt or not, that Bigsby needs to be rostered. D'Ernest Johnson could potentially be a play in week 8. I will say I don't feel great about the Jaguars' offense in week 8 because I'm expecting the Green Bay Packers to put up some points against this Jaguars defense, and that could hurt these running backs similar to what we saw in week 6 against the Bears. But at this point in time, if Bigsby is out there, he needs to be rostered. Moving along, at this point in time, I am also tired of talking about Alexander Mattison. We have talked about Mattison every single waiver wire video. We've talked about Mattison every single last-minute waiver wire video, the videos that I put out on Saturday mornings. Literally, every single video, 2 times a week, I've talked about Mattison in both editions of the waiver wire videos throughout the week, every week here in 2024. Mattison, 15.3 fantasy points in week 7. Going into week 7, he was sitting around 60% rostered. And what did I say in last week's video? He should be rostered in more leagues, even if Zamir White comes back. This is a great matchup against the Rams. Double-digit fantasy points again. He has double-digit fantasy points in every game except for 2 on the season. He's been great. I mean, maybe not great, but he's been very good. He's a top 25 running back in fantasy football. I don't care if Zamir White is active or not. I don't care what's going on with Amir Abdullah or Dylan Lobb. I don't care if Aiden O'Connell's a quarterback or Gardner Minshew's a quarterback. Mattison is a viable fantasy option. And with injuries out there, we don't have bye weeks, fortunately, this week. And just the overall craziness that this season has been, Mattison should be rostered in a higher percentage of leagues. Now, I will say it's a bad matchup in week 8. It is a home matchup at least, but it's a bad matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs run defense. this defense does scare me when we're looking at opposing running backs. And then they do get the Cincinnati Bengals in week 9, not too bad before a bye week, and then a good matchup in week 11 against the Dolphins. But overall, Madison has done enough that he should be rostered in more formats overall. And that'll bring us to Sean Tucker. I have to record these videos on Sunday night, so don't know what's happened in Monday Night Football because it has not been played, but let's say Sean Tucker has a productive day. Like, I mean, it's going to depend on, I guess if Rachaad White plays or not. And this is another backfield that's very confusing, and they get 2 bad matchups in a row with the Falcons and the Chiefs the next 2 weeks. But put Sean Tucker on here. Should really have an asterisk next to his name. If he has a good enough productive outing in Monday Night Football in week 7, then we can definitely consider Sean Tucker moving forward. But yeah, I mean, we got, Bucky Irving, Rachaad White. This is a headache of a running back committee to take a look at from a fantasy perspective. But if Tucker does enough in Monday Night Football, we can certainly consider him a waiver wire add. And since it's thin at the running back position this week, try to have, an additional name or two for you guys. Kamani Vidal, another player playing on Monday Night Football, sitting at 23% rostered. This is definitely a player to watch going into tonight's game. He had 13.1 fantasy points, a receiving touchdown in week 6, only 4 touches on the ground, but this is a run-first offense that's going to utilize the running back position. They have a great matchup against the Cardinals tonight. And overall, if he has a productive day, this is going to become a priority add because, once again, overall, it's just thin at the running back position. Good system for Kamani Vidal. Could certainly continue to see production in the receiving game. We'll see how he does on Monday Night Football, but after that matchup, he'll get the Saints, who have just been getting shredded by running backs lately. Then the Browns, the Titans, the Bengals. Not too bad of a stretch coming up for the Chargers at the running back position. But we'll see what Vidal does against the Cardinals tonight. Then last but not least, we got Tyler Goodson, who I do think is primarily contingent on the health of Jonathan Taylor. So we don't know at this point in time if JT is going to play in week 8 or not as he continues to deal with that ankle injury. But when we look at the Colts running backs right now, in relief of Jonathan Taylor, we got Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson. And I'm completely off of Trey Sermon moving forward. I thought he could maybe muster up a touchdown and get 10-ish fantasy points in week 7 because the Dolphins' run defense is so bad. But no, Trey Sermon just literally sucks. He had his best game in terms of being a starter in terms of yards per carry at 4.5, but he's just doing nothing. Tyler Goodson, on the other hand, has had 8.7 or more fantasy points in the last 3 weeks, double digits in the last 2 weeks, and scored a touchdown, 3.64 yards per carry, 51 yards on the ground. It's not the best matchup against the Texans on the road here. Then it's another bad matchup in week 9 against the Vikings. So, I'm not going out of my way to add Tyler Goodson or Trey Sermon. Definitely not Trey Sermon. But if you need some points, you're absolutely desperate. We see a lot of leagues, a lot of formats, a lot of rosters, all that stuff. Goodson could certainly be at least worth an addition and get you some points as we move into week 8 if Jonathan Taylor is out. Move along to the wide receiver position, and let's start with the Romeo Doubs, who had 17.4 fantasy points against the Texans. Good game script for Romeo Doubs this past week. 10 targets, 8 catches, 94 receiving yards, 17.4 fantasy points. This is what we want to see here and there out of Romeo Doubs. We don't want these low-volume games where he catches 1 or 2 touchdowns and he gets double digits because of the touchdowns scored. We want to see some games like this where he's getting you double digits because he's being targeted and he's catching multiple passes. So good for Doubs. Overall, I mean, Jaden Reed is still the wide receiver 1 on this team, in my opinion, even though he had just 4 targets and 2 receptions this past week. And, I would say Doubs is definitely a priority add, but we'll talk about Christian Watson, who also had a down week in week 7 and a good game script against the Texans. 2 targets, just 1 reception for 1.5 fantasy points. He sits at 55% rostered. You still see his name on the screen. And that is because this team is playing the Jaguars in week 8. They are on the road, but this is going to be a good game script. If the Jaguars can keep up, and if they can't, then this defense is just flat out awful. I'm expecting points scored by the Packers. So Christian Watson will at least be a flex play if you're desperate this week due to upside because of the matchup. And Romeo Doubs overall is now we're at least getting a consistent pattern emerging. So Doubs, definitely worth the ad. Watson, potentially worth the ad. if you are desperate and or need some upside. So basically, we're just going to look at the fact that they're playing the Jaguars and they are close to that 50% roster rate, maybe a little bit over it, but close enough that you guys may be able to add them. Next up is Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills, who will travel to face the Seattle Seahawks here in Week 8. And Keon Coleman, I mean, this was one of the things we talked about early in the week after the Amari Cooper trade, was that there's the potential that adding Amari Cooper to this receiver room is going to open things up for the other receivers. And Khalil Shakir, 13.5 fantasy points. He sits at 69% rostered, 7 targets, 7 receptions, 65 receiving yards. I do like Shakir as a nice, steady, consistent floor option. But Keon Coleman, 7 targets, 4 receptions, 125 receiving yards, 16.5 fantasy points. And that was with 5 targets, 4 receptions, a touchdown reception, 66 receiving yards, and 16.6 fantasy points too. Amari Cooper. So certainly an interesting situation shaking out here. Curtis Samuel banged up again. Mac Hollins, just 1 target, 0 receptions. And then it's also worth mentioning that Dalton Kincaid had 6 targets and 3 receptions. So it's going to be interesting to continue to see how this plays out in terms of the volume and who may or may not be volatile. But right now, I think that Shakir, Cooper, and Coleman, as well as Kincaid, all will have options as receiving threats on the Bills team at this point in time. So this was also nice to see for Keon Coleman because this was his first game above 5 targets. And in the games where he, let's just say, had 9.1 or more fantasy points, because he's only hit double digits once this year in Week 5 against Houston. In 2 of those games, he scored a touchdown. Week 1, he did not score a touchdown and had 9.1 fantasy points. So overall, it was nice to see a game for Coleman where he hit double digits without scoring a touchdown, and hopefully that pattern can continue here. The Bills will get the Seahawks, the Dolphins, the Colts in the next 3 weeks. These should be good matchups, good game scripts for the most part overall. So Coleman sitting at 52% rostered, I think is a good add, but expect some volatility with him. All right, next up is Juju Smith-Schuster, who was a really popular ad going into Week 7. Also a popular ad going into Week 6 on the Chiefs bye week, but he was out with that hamstring injury against the San Francisco 49ers. The Chiefs will travel to face the Raiders this week. Should be a great matchup for this Chiefs offense. And if Juju is out there, then I think he's a really strong start. In his last start in Week 5, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 130 receiving yards, and 20 fantasy points. So we did see a little bit of juice, I guess, out of McCole Hardman, but at the same time, not really. I mean, he scored a touchdown, but that was really it. Xavier Worthy had 8 targets, but just 3 receptions. He was another guy who was getting, the ball in his hands. Similar to McCole Hardman, by not catching the football. So we're seeing, these wide receivers on the Chiefs be used in unique ways, not surprising. But, outside of that, we saw some nice volume to Noah Gray, but we didn't really have any other wide receivers step up in any way. So I do believe once Juju is back, assuming he's back in Week 8, that he's going to be in a spot where he can see some volume. If Juju's out there, he's worth adding because he could turn into a viable option here in Week 8. All right, so Brandon Ayuk goes down. Definitely a very disappointing year for Brandon Ayuk owners. Only had 1 game over 9.8 fantasy points on the season, and now the initial belief is that he tore his ACL and will more than likely be out for the year. I guess it has not been confirmed yet. Maybe by the time this video goes out, it will be confirmed. So let's talk about who could be up next here. This was a weird game, but this was kind of a good thing with Debo, who had an illness and was not able to play and was ruled out, even though he technically started. This was kind of a good thing at the same time because we got a little bit of a sneak peek at what wide receivers could potentially step up. And at the same time, Jawan Jennings was also out in Week 7 dealing with that hip injury. So we got a pretty good look here. But Jawan Jennings has dropped to 37% rostered. He might be back. He might still be very volatile. But if he's out there in your league, he's certainly worth adding. I don't think we really need to break him down too in depth. We know what he can do. We know the lows. We know the highs. He's a good upside play. He is still technically, at the time of recording this, a top 15 fantasy wide receiver on the year, partly or mainly, due to week 3, where he had 46.5 fantasy points. But let's take a look at Ricky Pearsall, who got his first NFL start in week 7. 5 targets, 3 receptions, 21 receiving yards, 5.1 fantasy points. Nothing crazy, but you have to imagine he's going to get some sort of involvement in this offense. So great prospect coming out of college. Overall, sitting at 24% rostered, I definitely think he's worth picking up because he kind of fits this offense well. And they have some nice upcoming matchups. Dallas in week 8, then a bye week, then Tampa Bay, Seattle, Green Bay, Buffalo, Chicago, the Rams, Miami, Detroit. These are all good game scripts, even if they're not all the best matchups. They're all good game scripts for the rest of the year, where the Niners are probably going to need to throw the football. And the Niners are in a very tough spot right now where they're going to need to start to piece together some wins. So I like Ricky Pearsall. Once again, I don't think we need to break him down too extensively. I think we all kind of have our own opinions on Ricky Pearsall. But the interesting player for me is Jacob Cowing, who had 3 targets, 2 receptions, 50 receiving yards, and 7 fantasy points. This was another name towards the end of the offseason that started to emerge as kind of a sleeper on this offense, also in his rookie season. So we got 2 rookies here. And I guess very quickly worth mentioning, you got Ronnie Bell, who did score a touchdown, but had just 2 targets. No, I'm sorry. He did not score a touchdown. That's right. He was down at the 1 yard line. So just 2 fantasy points. Then Chris Conley had 2 targets, 0 receptions. So I think it's really between Pearsall and Jacob Cowing going into week 8 and for the rest of the season as who is going to step up as a wide receiver 3, but we still got to take a heavy look at Jawan Jennings. The problem is Jennings could be out in week 8. And especially because the Niners have a bye week in week 9. But Kyle Shanahan did come out and say that he is hopeful that Jennings plays in week 8. So we'll see what happens. Certainly still be some more initial opportunities for Ricky Pearsall and Jacob Cowing, but they're still both stashes. Don't want to get too excited as we approach week 8. All right, moving along, Tutu Atwell. I want to take a heavy look at it. I do know, or we know now that Cooper Kupp's going to play in week 8 against the Vikings, which is great news for the Rams offense, who had another really bad week, and great news for those of us who own Cooper Kupp in fantasy football. But let's talk about Tutu Atwell, who's been the most consistent wide receiver overall in the absence of Cooper Kupp and Puka Nakua's injuries. Double-digit fantasy points every week since week 3 for Tutu Atwell, 11.1 or more, 11.1 in week 7, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 51 receiving yards. So listen, I really like Jordan Whittington, but he did nothing in week 7. Nothing. He was active, but he was coming off of that shoulder injury, right? And then just didn't get involved in the game. Literally was not on the field at all. Then you have Demarcus Robinson, who had 1.9 fantasy points. You have Tyler Johnson, who had 9.7, but hasn't done anything close to that since week 1 of the season. So I think the most important wide receiver to take a look at in terms of who we can pick up off the waiver wire for the Rams is easily Tutu Atwell. Double digits, past 4 games, good matchup in week 8 against the Minnesota Vikings. Remember, this secondary overall is very weak, even if that front 7 is fantastic. So Tutu Atwell's out there, even with Cooper Kupp coming back. I like Tutu going into the week if you are struggling at the position. And last but not least, we have Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. Deshaun Watson suffered what is believed to be an Achilles injury and is a season-ending injury, no doubt. I wish I could say I feel bad, but I don't really. This is good for fantasy football. This is good for real life football. I do hope he has a speedy recovery, but I don't think I need to say anything else. Okay, so DTR came in. Then he had a finger injury. And then what everyone's been waiting for this season, we saw a little sprinkle of Jameis Winston, who also apparently likes Cedric Tillman, but DTR gave some targets to Tillman as well. Regardless, Tillman finished with 12 targets, 8 receptions, 81 receiving yards, and 18.1 fantasy points. And this is a player who's been a sleeper in some aspects of the fantasy community in the offseason and different times of the season. Jerry Jeudy was basically pointless in this week 7 game. 5 targets, 1 reception, 2.8 fantasy points. Then we got Elijah Moore, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 10.1 fantasy points. Okay. Listen, Tillman's a good stash, especially if you play in like a 3 wide receiver league or a league with, additional bench spots. I like Tillman right now. He has some upside, could certainly turn into a viable receiving option in this offense. Also worth noting, Njoku had 14 targets and 10 receptions. So good time to own David Njoku. And there's still a lot of volatility here. I mean, we're kind of playing with fire, but it's a good matchup against the Ravens in week 8 at the time of recording this. They've given up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. So plenty of risk here, when we're looking at DTR and Jameis Winston as the starting quarterbacks, but a little bit of upside. If you can afford to stash Cedric Tillman, I certainly think he's worth it as we approach week 8. Last but certainly not least, let's hop into some quarterbacks and tight ends, and let's kick it off with Caleb Williams coming off of the bye week that the Bears had in week 7. They will now travel to face the Washington Commanders in week 8, and not sneezing at this Commanders defense. They played very well this past week. If you guys watched last week's Must Start Defenses and Streams, I did make that call. But regardless, I do like Caleb Williams this week, who has 19 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups. The quarterback 12 at the time I'm recording this in fantasy football, but bear in mind, 69% roster, not ideal for picking up a player off the waiver wire, but check to see if he's available, because he did have that bye week in week 7. If he's out there and available, he is certainly worth rostering. Moving along, we got Sam Darnold, who's also sitting at 67% rostered, 17.2 fantasy points, 259 passing yards, a touchdown, and a pick. Good enough. Sam Darnold continues to be a player that should be rostered. He's got a good matchup against the Rams in week 8. I just want you guys to listen to this stretch. I talked about this stretch going into week 6 for the bye week for the Vikings, and I talked about it this past week going into week 7 as well. The Rams, the Colts, the Jaguars, the Titans, the Bears, the Cardinals, the Falcons, the Bears again, Seattle, and the Packers. This stretch for the Vikings, whether you're going after Sam Darnold, whether you own Aaron Jones, whether you own JJ or Addison, whether you got Hawkinson on IR, whether you own the Vikings defense, this is a fantastic stretch. I know they lost this game to the Lions, very close game. They still looked good overall. If Darnold's out there, especially because he's coming off of a bye. I know he didn't have the bye this past week, but he might be floating around in your league. Darnold is a strong overall add. Then we got Geno Smith, who I still had faith in going into week 7. I liked the potential for a high-scoring game, and the Falcons didn't really deliver, but the Seahawks did deliver, and Geno Smith is a top 10 fantasy quarterback at the time of recording this, and he had 17.7 fantasy points, 207 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, didn't throw any picks, 15 yards on the ground, did have a fumble, but it wasn't a lost fumble. So Geno, it's not super exciting to start Geno Smith, but if you need somebody to spot play, I know there's no bye weeks this week, but we do have more coming up. Still guys like Anthony Richardson that are really disappointing. Maybe even Patrick Mahomes, is losing to your matchups, whatever. Geno is a viable option on a week in, week out basis. The upside's not crazy high, but like I said, he's a top 10 quarterback. He should probably be rostered in more leagues. They get Buffalo this week, then the Rams should have a good game script, and then a good matchup the following week. All right, once again, I have to record these on Sunday night. Don't know how Aaron Rodgers, I should say, has necessarily looked against the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think there's a potential that this is a low-scoring defensive game. I also think there's some potential for some points in this game. And Rodgers and company looked better in week 6. If he can piece together a decent game here, then I do like him a lot this week against the New England Patriots. We got Devontae Adams in this roster now. We still got other playmakers with Garrett Wilson, Allen Lazard, Breece Hall, Tyler Conklin at tight end. So the play calling was better in week 6. Maybe Rodgers is atrocious tonight. If he is, go ahead and roast me in the comments. But overall, it's a good matchup against the New England Patriots on the road here in week 8. And don't forget, Rodgers had 21 fantasy points in week 3 against the Patriots. So he could certainly be a streaming option. Once again, no buys this week, but I don't know. Maybe you feel like you need to stream a quarterback. Rodgers might be that guy. Okay, I talked about Drake May a lot going into week 7. The matchup was there, right? Matchup was fantastic against the Jaguars. Too good to ignore. He was another solid start. 21.5 fantasy points in his first start in week 6. 20.8 fantasy points in week 7 in London against the Jaguars. 276 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and 18 total rushing yards. So This is a tougher matchup for sure at home for Drake May against the Jets. But like if you're in a super flex format, a double quarterback format, he might not be out there and available, but he should definitely be picked up in those types of formats. And then, yeah, I mean, once again, if you're struggling at quarterback, you want to throw someone on your bench. I think Drake May is a player that we can spot play at times throughout the season. The Titans in week 9, the Rams in week 11, the Colts in week 13, Cardinals in week 15. There's going to be times throughout the season, as long as this pattern continues, that Drake May is going to be a startable quarterback in fantasy football. All right, once again, I don't know how Sunday Night Football has looked, but Russell Wilson getting the start against the Jets. We'll see, how involved Fields gets or doesn't get with Arthur Smith at offensive coordinator. Who knows? But if Wilson pieces together a nice game, I do think that he's worth rostering, especially in double quarterback superflex leagues. But I think tonight could be a tough, first start for Russell Wilson. And then week 8 against the Giants at home could also be tough. But this Giants defense looks really good at times and looks really bad like they did this past week. So we'll see there. But the main reason to go ahead and stash Russell Wilson or potentially own Russell Wilson on the bench would be that after the bye week in week 9, the Steelers have a really strong schedule. They play the Commanders, the Ravens. I know the Ravens are still good, but they give up a lot of fantasy points. The Browns, the Bengals, the Browns again, the Eagles, the Ravens, and a tough matchup in the fantasy championship against the Chiefs. But a lot of poor secondaries, a lot of good game scripts. If Russell Wilson's the starter in that stretch, then I think he can definitely piece together some solid fantasy outings. Okay, let's move along to the tight end position. Cole Kmet probably isn't available, sitting at 73% rostered. But if he got dropped in your league and he's available, he needs to be picked up. He's a top 5 fantasy tight end at the time I'm recording this. He's probably not available. If he did get dropped, just go check. If he's out there, he is a viable starter week in and week out. He's going to have some lows. He's going to have some highs, but there's really only so much you can ask for at this point in the season with the tight end position. Okay, Cade Otton also has not played at the time of recording this, but he's been very good from weeks 3 through week 6 with 7.4 or more fantasy points in all those matchups. He's got a good matchup against the Ravens tonight. So if Cade Otton is out there and available, you need help at the position, especially if he pieces together a good game against the Ravens and a matchup where I'm expecting points. Then I do like Cade Otton as a player that, if he has a good game overall in week 7, then he's just a player that deserves to be rostered overall. Good tight end 2 to have on the bench, a good player that you can plug in when you need to. All right, moving along, we got Zach Ertz, my top streaming candidate at the position going into the week. You guys go back to last week's Sunday morning video or last week's waiver wire video, talked about Cade Otton, Zach Ertz, and Hunter Henry a lot throughout the week. And Ertz was just a smash play against the Panthers defense that really struggles against the tight end position. 14 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Now, I will say, obviously Jaden Daniels left the game, and it looks like he's probably going to be good to go in week 8. But Marcus Mariota was looking Zach Ertz's way throughout this game. So, Mariota starts next week. I think that's good for Ertz. If he doesn't, then I think Ertz is probably still okay. I mean, he's been a pretty solid fantasy tight end. 7.2 or more points in every game this year, except for weeks 1 and 5. So I like Ertz. The ceiling's not super high, but I think he's a pretty solid start week in and week out. It's not the greatest matchup against the Bears, but he should still be okay. Next up is Hunter Henry, who also doesn't have the greatest matchup against the Jets, but he sits at 29% rostered, and Drake May is looking his way, using Hunter Henry as a nice security blanket. No touchdowns in week 7 after scoring a touchdown and having 13.1 fantasy points in week 6. But he did have 9 targets, 8 receptions, and 92 receiving yards, 17.2 fantasy points. So I will say Hunter Henry is one of these tight ends that worries me when he starts performing well, because he did that in week 2. Then he had 5.2 or less fantasy points for 3 weeks straight. But this offense looks different with Drake May at quarterback. They're throwing the football more effectively, and more importantly, Drake May is looking Hunter Henry's direction. So if he's out there and available, I do think he's a solid tight end pickup. Then we got Noah Fant in that same category. He worries me, but now we have 3 double-digit fantasy performances in the last 5 matchups. 10.5 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 65 receiving yards this past week. The Seahawks get the Bills and the Rams in the next 2 weeks, so good game scripts, potentially good matchups there. Not my favorite addition, but I do think that Noah Fant is worth adding if you're struggling. Then we got a really interesting one in Jonnu Smith, who I do like, but I want to be careful here. He's gotten really involved in the past 2 weeks. 8 targets, 5 receptions, 11.1 fantasy points in week 5, the week 6 bye week for the Dolphins. Then 22.6 fantasy points here in week 7 against the Colts. 7 targets, 7 receptions, 96 receiving yards, and a touchdown. But he's been mainly involved with Tyler Huntley at quarterback, then a little sprinkle of Tim Boyle this past week. So the expectation is that Tua Tagovailoa will be playing in week 8 against the Cardinals. So I don't know if that changes things for Jonnu Smith. But he did have 22 fantasy points in week 7 and does have 3 double-digit performances in his last 5 starts. So it's kind of difficult for me to ignore. So he sits at a 7% roster, maybe a good stash if you're kind of struggling at the position or if you think your tight end is volatile or injury prone or whatever. But I don't want to get too excited about Jonnu Smith, but certainly worth a look. And then last but not least, we got Noah Gray, who had 10.6 fantasy points in week 7 against the Niners, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 66 receiving yards. So there's another one. I don't want to get too excited, but it's a good matchup against the Raiders in week 8. And once again, we're just looking who's getting additional volume on this Chiefs offense while they're dealing with all of these injuries. Kelsey had just 5 targets, 4 receptions, 17 receiving yards this past week, but he's still the tight end 1 on this team. And, will things change? If Juju's back in week 8, is that going to mean less, potential volume for Noah Gray? I don't know, maybe. But if you're in a deeper format, Noah Gray is at least worth a flyer if you're absolutely desperate due to the matchup and the higher volume that he saw this past week and a little bit of higher volume that he saw in week 4 as well. That'll do it for today's video. There's every player that you can consider adding off of the waiver wire moving into week 8 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 8 of the season, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video. Don't forget, guys, as the week goes on, we're going to have everything that you need here on the channel for week 8 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, kicker ratings, buy low options, players that you can't bench, players that are sneaky starts, last minute waiver additions, live fantasy Q&A streams, everything that you guys could need to bring home a dub here in week 8. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.